heard this passage of Scripture from Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 6, and maybe live with this passage through the week. This passage was written in a time of extreme trauma for the people of God, and the writer knows that life sometimes can become so dark and so desolate that there is this longing for a new heaven and a new earth. In the first, I'm going to give you a little history here, and this, especially for people who are going on the trip to Israel and Rome that's coming up in a few weeks. We use this passage, and there's some things that we'll point out to you over there that I'll relate. But in the first century AD, it's the appropriate term now is CE, Common Era, but most of us are familiar with AD. Somebody used AD and BC. In the first century, year 0 to year 100, the Jewish people were hoping and they were praying for a new day. They believed that God would raise up for them a messianic figure, a sort of son of David figure. David being the greatest king that Israel had ever known, and united the tribes of Israel and established Jerusalem as the center of the presence of God among the Jewish people. This Messiah would restore the kingdom again and would cleanse the nation of extreme Roman occupation, high taxation, persecution. Jesus died in approximately 33 AD, in the first century, during a time of great unrest. And this unrest was in response to the harsh dictatorship of Pontius Pilate, who was the 5th Roman prefect over Jerusalem, or Judea. Israel was not called Israel in the first century. It was divided into regions, okay? So Jesus would not have been familiar with living in Israel. Jesus grew up in Galilee. Jerusalem, the capital of Judea, was in the south, the strongest part of what we call now the nation of Israel. Jewish rebellion against Rome grew in the period, especially the years 60 to 90. A crucial period. This was a time of vast change for this tiny nation of Israel that we call it today, and the beginning of a movement called the Way. The Way was a movement of Jewish and non-Jewish followers in Jesus who believed that Jesus was the Son of God, the Son of David, the Messiah, the Hebrew term, or the Christ, the Greek term. And following his death in 33 AD, they never stopped believing in him as God's chosen one. And so that the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all written in this turbulent time, the years 70 through 95. The people going on the trip will be spending some time at the Dead Sea. And this, you don't see much of the Dead Sea, but I wanted to get Masada in there as well. Refugees from Jerusalem fled during the time of the 60s and 70s. They needed somewhere to go. And so they fled south to the Dead Sea. And they fled and they hid in the caves up above a site called Qumran. And Qumran was a religious community, an extreme religious community, that may have produced some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we discovered in the 1940s. Qumran was destroyed in 68. Jerusalem, along with the temple, this grand wonder of the world, one of the 10 ancient wonders of the world. The temple was destroyed in 70, and so the soul of the Jewish people was literally razed to the ground. So the last Jewish resistance to Roman occupation took place on the top of this high cliff, this 1,400 feet high cliff called Masada. And for at least 1 year, maybe 3 years, 960 Jewish men, women, and children lived on top of this mountain, this flat-top rock, where they were persecuted by thousands of Roman soldiers. And as the soldiers finally built this dirt ramp, you'll see that today, up to the top of Masada, when they reached the top, they found all 960 except one person who told the story. They found all 959 people had committed suicide. For the Jewish people, this was the end. This was the end of a nation. This was the beginning of a new day. In today's lesson from Revelation, don't ever say Revelations. That's not right. Revelation. You'll hear it on TV. You'll hear other people talk about it. Correct them always. My New Testament professor, you were in bad trouble if you said Revelations. It's the book of Revelation. It's the book of the apocalypse, of the unfolding. It is the beginning of a new day. It is the end of one era and the beginning of a new. And John, the writer of this pastoral letter, addressed 7 churches in Asia Minor, 7 Jewish Christian congregations in Asia Minor, and said in verse 1, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed, and the sea was no more." Could that be a remembrance of this sea? Probably not. John is writing these words 25 years after Masada, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70. Titus, who is the son of Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian of Rome, Emperor Vespasian sent lots of Jewish armies to finally conquer this pesky Jewish nation. And Titus was one son who was sent here among in other areas around Israel, or modern-day Israel. The other son was Domitian, and Domitian was off fighting in another part of the world. But Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian, was leading the legions who burned the temple and the city of Jerusalem to the ground. And Titus paraded thousands of Jewish prisoners through the streets of Rome and took the treasures of the temple, the gold, the bronze, the copper, and most likely that was the gold and the bronze and copper that built the Colosseum in 80, just prior to Domitian's rule. I know it's confusing, a lot of names here. Now it's 90 AD. And the emperor cult, the Roman emperor cult, that began with Augustus Caesar was at an all-time high. And the followers of Jesus were facing a choice: either give up your religion and turn to Emperor Domitian, or face persecution. Domitian was a great builder, and the ruins that we're going to be seeing in the Roman Forum stem mainly from the years of Domitian in 90 and on. Domitian was a great builder, but Domitian wanted to restore Rome back to the way Caesar Augustus ran it. Very conservatively. Domitian ended up being pretty crazy and was killed by his own followers. Domitian wanted to rid Rome and the world of anyone who followed the son of David, or who was associated with the son of David, Jews or Jewish Christians. Rome had sought for quite a while to tie together its vast empire, which had encompassed a lot of different cultures and religions and countries in the Middle East. And Rome sought a way, it wanted to make religion universal, sort of like Alexander Campbell, who was the founder of this movement, the Disciples of Christ, in the early 1800s. It's like, we just can't stand it, so many religions. So let's bring everybody together, let's make everybody alike, which is the worst thing anybody can do in the world. Because how boring is the world when everybody thinks and believes the same way? We are just not made that way. And so if all the conquered peoples through the Roman Empire could be persuaded to bow down and worship the emperor as God, then this would be the common religion that would tie the world together. Good news for Rome, bad news for everybody else. There would be unity throughout the empire, and governing such a vast amount of land would be easier, or so Rome thought. It's a good lesson for the Empire of the United States of America to learn. You don't rule the world. You don't. You can't. You can't. John's principal concern is to convince members of the 7 churches in Asia Minor to persist and persevere in their loyalty to Jesus and not Caesar. And Emperor Domitian demanded his subjects to address him as my Lord and my God. That's recorded in history. Now remember Thomas, the disciple who wasn't with the other disciples during the appearance after Jesus' resurrection. And Jesus comes back and appears to the disciples behind locked doors in Jerusalem. And remember Thomas's response when he sees Jesus, my Lord and my God. That's political church. That's the early church saying, my loyalty is to Jesus and not Domitian. We don't read that, but that's why that's there. Jesus invites Thomas to touch his wounds in his hands and his side, and Thomas believes in Jesus. Loyalty to Jesus was in opposition to loyalty demanded by Caesar, and if you profess loyalty to Jesus, then you probably weren't safe walking the streets if anybody knew. So John's vision of a new heaven and a new earth echoes the promise by God that had been given long ago through the prophet Isaiah, that God would create a new heavens and a new earth, which would abide forever. And the Jewish people still have that vision, Jews and Jewish Christians. So this new creation will have some continuity with creation as we know it, yet it will be radically different. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And as Revelation chapter 21, verses 3 and 4 says, He will dwell with them as their God. They will be His peoples, and God will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying will be no more. That's there because there was a lot of death, there was a lot of mourning, and there was a lot of crying due to the persecutions of Jews and Christians under the reign of Domitian. And John goes on to describe the new city, the new Jerusalem. And his vision is drawn from Hebrew scripture and from Greek and Roman aspirations of the ideal city. Because in the first century, in the 90s, believe it or not, we're in the 2000s and we're still migrating toward the city. But it began in 90. People were migrating to the cities, and so this new vision is of this new Jerusalem, a city. Why a city? Because people were moving there for work. They couldn't find it out in the pastoral settings anymore. Cities are places where people are dependent on each other and resources and food is available. A city works when everyone in the city does something to contribute to its welfare. That's what community is. That's the gift of cities like Lincoln, Nebraska. Our church is a model of community. Our church is a mini city. Our church is a mini vision of a new heaven and a new earth, a new Jerusalem, so to say. Because church works when we're church together. When we see our life dependent on each other. When our relationships become so closely intertwined. And church, that is the biggest challenge that you and I face. Bethany Christian Church, my goodness, we're not a neighborhood church anymore. We have families driving from Omaha and from south of the city and from northwest and northeast. None of our children hardly go to the same schools. Creating community in Bethany Christian Church is hard. It takes work, and we have to be intentional about that, and we're going to be more intentional about that. And guess what? You're going to help me. You are going to help me. We shine like the sun into our community, our wider community, when we welcome our community here. When we feed the community, as people do. This last month, we've fed 63 individuals and 14 families, and have given to-go packs for 2 others. And fed 24 families through Good Neighbor Center. That's what your church is doing every single month. In the context of Easter, this passage may be understood as providing strength and hope in desperate times. Our desperate times are different than John's churches that he was writing to. John wasn't writing this to us. John was writing this to churches in 95 AD. But you know what the wonderful gift of Scripture is that the churches in 95 AD aren't that different from us in 2019. Because we still go through times of trauma. We still have broken people among us. We still have problems that our government can't fix. We still go to the doctor and receive a diagnosis of cancer or Alzheimer's. Whole communities are destroyed by tornadoes and earthquakes and floods. God's natural world continues to be destroyed by humanity's need to consume and to create oil spills and mining and deforestation. We still receive the trauma, the news that our job is moved and we are without, and the helpless feelings that accompany it. We still see thousands of people lined up at our borders waiting to get in for a better life, a vision of that new Jerusalem, that new city, but are yet locked out. We still have people going through physical and emotional abuse and the fear of repeated abuse by a spouse or a parent. Yes, the book of Revelation was born out of a period of human despair, of crisis, of trauma. And it speaks to us when we too go through that dark night of the soul and we don't know where to turn because the trauma is so great. In the New Jerusalem, as Scripture says, there is no wrong that God can't make right. There is no pain that God can't remove. There is no evil that goodness can't overcome. That is a vision. That is a vision of God that makes us sing and that puts a smile on our face. That, like a rainbow after a storm that's scared us to death, we can look out and see a vision of a new day in the heavens. So, church, let's walk in the vision of a new day. We invite you to become a part of the movement that seeks to bring wholeness and life to a community that's sometimes broken and fragmented. And we invite you to come and join us